Orientalism is about the relationship between language, writing, cultural politics, and power. Edward Said argues that Western writers have created a predominantly hostile image of Eastern cultures and people as inferior and stagnant. Then, the West took advantage of these representations to justify their imperialist policies in the Middle East. So we'll go over some key points and definitions, then we'll summarize each chapter, and then we'll do a brief summary of the entire book at the end. Be sure to stick around. Said gives 3 definitions for Orientalism. First, Orientalism is a style of thought based on an epistemological and ontological distinction made between the Orient and, most of the time, the Occident. Basically, this distinction emphasizes the alleged superiority of the Westerner, or the Occident, and the alleged inferiority of the Easterner, or the Orient. The second definition is that Orientalism is a field of study that includes anybody that teaches, researches, investigates, or writes about the Orient. Third, Orientalism is a corporate institution for dealing with the Orient that began in the 18th century. Edward Said describes Orientalism as a discourse. He borrows this definition from French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault. I definitely mispronounced that. Basically, a discourse is the interaction between power and knowledge in an overlapping and continuous cycle. To Foucault, knowledge is power and is the way to gain power, and the knowledge is privileged only to Europeans. If I were to oversimplify this concept, basically, if you study a people and know about them and write about them, you have power over them. The one who writes the story has the power to tell the story the way that they choose. One direct example of this from the book is Balfour's speech to the House of Commons in 1910. In his speech, Balfour tries to justify Britain's involvement and imperialism in Egypt. So the argument was basically that the British knew Egypt, its history, its society, its people, and they knew what Egypt needed at that point in its development. Pretentious, I know. Said also mentions that there's a subtle and persistent Eurocentric bias against Arab and Islamic people and cultures, and this trend can still be seen today. 4 major claims that Said makes in his book are: number 1, while Orientalism poses as an objective and honest field of study, it was really used to justify imperialism, and the inaccurate definitions that the West comes up with to describe the East begin to influence the East, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Number 2, Orientalism was actually more about defining the West through the lens of the East than it was about accurately studying the East. Number 3, points 1 and 2 can be seen when the entire Eastern world, or most of it, is seen as a homogeneous group. Anything in the Middle East or India is seen as very similar in culture. Said also takes issue with the terms Orient and Occident, but he uses them because the literature has been using it for a very long time. Number 4, Orientalists, whether they're researchers or writers, are a product of the system and the culture that they come from. They can't help but misrepresent the East. To have a more accurate representation of the Eastern world, Easterners need to write and speak for themselves, and Said starts this trend by writing Orientalism. Chapter 1. Said goes into how the science of Orientalism was a system of knowledge. Orientalists created a perception of the East and the West with distinct qualities and characteristics. To Western eyes, Easterners were incapable of taking care of themselves and their own countries. They were lazy, primitive, irrational, lustful, and violent, but they were also exotic and mysterious. The West thought it was more capable of understanding Easterners than Easterners themselves. However, the study of Orientalism was biased and selective. The terminology was Western and it was foreign to the East, and the acts of individual people were generalized and extrapolated to describe entire groups of people. Said argues Orientalism was how the Western world saw itself as superior by describing the East as uncivilized. Europe projected everything that it didn't want to admit about itself onto the Easterner, and some of this includes sexual fantasies. And believe me, this comes up a lot more than you probably expect. Like, you have the French fantasizing over Algerian women, the exotification and the fetishization of Eastern women. It still happens today. Chapter 2 describes the modern attitude towards the Orient. The land of the Orient and the Orient was considered to be unsophisticated, unspoiled, and exotic compared to the highly complex and civilized Western world. By claiming that the Orient was uncivilized and primitive and innocent, the West could justify controlling the Eastern world and claiming that it was for the benefit of the Orient. Another justification for controlling the East was a type of social Darwinism, basically survival of the fittest. Orientalists argue that the high development rate and the industrialization of the West meant that Westerners were biologically superior. In this chapter, Said analyzes the work of prominent Orientalists like Sylvester de Sacy, or however you pronounce his name, and Ernest Renan, and he analyzes the kind of lineage of their thinking and where their biased ideas come from. He traces the flow of the ideas and the prejudice that they inherited. Chapter 3 describes more recent developments, and by recent I mean, according to his time, at the time of writing the book, primarily deals with 19th and 20th century. Said argues that Orientalism has shifted to be more involved in the life of the Orient. It's geopolitical and cultural. It's a quest for knowledge and power, which leads to more knowledge and power. Then Said talks about liberal, but still biased, Orientalists like Massignon and Gibb, who primarily try to portray Islam as inferior and weak. Westerners couldn't properly understand Islam because it developed outside of Europe. They wrongfully assumed that it was the Eastern imitation or equivalent of Christianity, which goes back to an important theme of opposites, with the East and the West both having one, but the West always having a superior counterpart. Orientalists made generalizations and parallels, like equating the Prophet Muhammad in Islam to Christ in Christianity. This is problematic because Muslims see Muhammad and Jesus as prophets, while believing none of them to have divinity, whereas most Christians believe that Christ was divine. Said argues that Orientalism kind of shifted to the United States after World War I in the form of social sciences, whereas in Europe it was linguistics. It was a field to help the government control non-Western societies. After World War II, it became more implicit and hidden. Even in the age of globalization that we live in today, Arabs are considered terrorists and all Japanese people are considered to know karate. Said concludes by saying that Easterners should be more active in the portrayal of their own people and cultures, and he also warns about making generalizations. To sum it all up, in a nutshell, Said argues Orientalism emerged out of the need for the West to define itself as the opposite of an unknown entity. In the Crusades, Europe saw that entity as the Orient. In more recent centuries, the West has found itself in positions of political and military power over the East, and often used this power to control the East. The fiction writers, the journalists, etc. were justifying the tradition and eventually the dynamic of the superior West, which is constantly growing and becoming more civilized, versus the stagnant East, which never grows or emerges or makes progress, developed. Said argues that it's impossible for any Orientalist scholar to break away from the tradition because they inherit those ideas from previous researchers and previous writers. They can't separate themselves from the culture that they belong to. However, though there are inaccurate representations of the Orient or Easterners can portray themselves and create their own history. Society is constantly changing and developing. Edward Said begins a trend of challenging the prejudices and the biases of the Western world by writing Orientalism, and he encourages the Orient or the Easterner to define themselves for a more accurate representation. And that concludes the summary. I hope you guys found it useful. If you enjoyed the summary, be sure to leave a like and subscribe because I post self-help content each week, and let me know if it was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.